All right, guys, let's finish up chapter 4 here. We got 3 sections to hustle through. So, first of all, let's talk about how new species come about. So we have this genetic diversity, reproduction, passing along the genes that are better suited for the environment, natural selection. And so as a result, what you can get is you can get reproductive isolation. So if it stays within one population, the population would evolve, of course, but how do we get 2 species from one? And that's through reproductive isolation. So splitting the gene pools into 2 different spots can lead to this term right here called speciation. Okay, so reproductive isolation can happen in these 3 major ways: geographic. Excuse me. Geographic means, like for instance, there's a mountain range that separates 2 different populations that were once together, or a river forms there, flows there, and cuts off these 2 different this one population, splits them into 2. Behavioral. 2 different, or one group of things can start acting in different ways, and so maybe, the dancing mating routine of one population, or one half the population, shifts and doesn't for the other one, and so there's a divide there between the 2 behaviors and how courting happens. And then the last major idea is temporal isolation, where, say, and this has to do with time, of course, this temporal isolation would be like maybe one group of deer starts to go in heat before the other group of deer, and so reproduction can only happen then at 2 different times for those different groups, and so they start to split according to that, for instance. So those are the 3 major ways we can have reproductive isolation or separation between one population creating 2 different gene pools. And then, of course, there's that term that I highlighted earlier of speciation, where we create a new species. By definition, a new species is formed when 2 organisms have a child, and that child can reproduce. So the baby has to be able to reproduce in order for that to happen. So examples that don't quite fit that would be, say for instance, a donkey and a horse. A donkey and a horse can have offspring. Those offspring are mules, but all mules are sterile. And so as a result, a donkey and a horse are not of the same species. Dogs, on the other hand, you can be one of a bunch of different breeds of dogs, and if you have offspring from that, they can reproduce with other things, thus making those of the same species. And so here's an example of 2 different species as a result of isolation. And so you have Arctic fox versus the gray fox. And so similar genetic makeup, of course, they're very close to one another, but they're isolated, physically isolated. Arctic fox live in the northern Yukon, and the gray fox lives in the southern part of the United States, most of the United States and southern part of the United States. And so they've adapted to have lighter fur and longer ears and legs and noses, so they can get rid of heat easier. These guys have shorter arms, or shorter, legs, ears, noses. Their fur matches their environment, and so there's genetic diversity as a result of those 2 things. Next, extinction. Extinction. I like this heading. It came with the PowerPoint basis, but extinction is forever. Yes, it is. Well, and we're starting to think about trying to bring some species back, so we'll see if it is forever for us. But currently, it's forever. I don't know, that really made an interesting color. So, extinction, when a population is gone, there's no more of them can exist. And so occurs when populations cannot adapt or change to environmental conditions, whether neutral or man-made. So it doesn't matter if we cause the extinction or it happens naturally. Extinction is extinction, and both varieties exist. Extinction is natural. It occurs, and it has occurred since the beginning of time. But in some cases, men have altered the way extinction happens on the planet. And when we talk about extinction, it usually is a result of endemic species. These are species found in one specific place, and they're vulnerable. And a good example is the golden toad, which is this picture right here. A golden toad is up in Costa Rica. It's in the cloud forest, and scientists argue it is the first creature that became extinct as a result of climate change. And so because it was an endemic species and lived in one part of the cloud forest in Costa Rica only, it was very susceptible to extinction, and the changing weather patterns, they believe, caused it to become extinct. And so extinction happens in two forms. One is called background extinction, and the other one's called mass extinction. And so extinctions happen constantly. So if you look throughout history, we've had extinctions. And so there's kind of a small amount of extinctions that happen on a fairly routine basis. And so that number is right here. Annually, we have about 0.00003, which is, what is that, 3/100%-ish of the populations of organisms become extinct on a yearly basis. Just that's how it is. But we've looked through and we've found that that gradual extinction is punctuated by mass extinctions, where we've seen extremely high rates of extinction across the globe, catastrophic changes of 25 to 75% of all the species on the planet become extinct. Important thing to keep in mind with these mass extinctions is they're terrible for some species because they no longer exist. So some organisms really suffer as a result of it, but other ones, it's an opportunity for them to become more successful. Mammals and dinosaurs are a good example. When the dinosaurs became extinct, it gave an opportunity for mammals to thrive. So if you look throughout history, there's been several mass extinctions, and so they're kind of listed right here. So there was the furthest one back we can go back to is about 500 million years ago, where 50% of all the animals, including trilobites, which are those little fossils that you see, little crustacean fossils, that was the first mass extinction a long, long time ago. Then later on, there's an extinction 350 million years ago, where a third of all the animal families, we lost them all. Later on in extinction, this one was crazy, 90% of animal families, including over 95% of marine creatures, trees, amphibians, a bunch of things in 250 million years ago. The Triassic period, 35% of the animal species died about 180 million years ago. And then we had an extinction past the Cretaceous a little bit, 65 million years ago. This is when the dinosaurs were lost from us. And we're currently in a mass extinction phase right now. The big difference between all of these, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 big ones that we know of, and that varies. Some scientists argue different things. But those 6 different mass extinctions, this one up here at the top is the only one that isn't natural. We believe humans are causing the vast majority of all the extinctions that are happening right now, which is alarming and something to be concerned of, especially from a biodiversity point of view. So we've played with the idea of natural selection and evolution, but we've also, humans have been doing artificial selection, where we've chose what genes we're interested in certain species and populations, and we've created artificial selection for a long, long time. And we've done that through a process of not necessarily gene manipulation directly. Now we're starting to do that. But we've done it through a process called selective breeding, where we chose creatures that had traits that we were interested in. For instance, if you look down here, maybe we wanted a bigger mouse. So we took big mice and we bred them together, which would result in more and more bigger mice. And so we've done that with a variety of things. A lot of the food you eat, corn for instance, didn't used to be as big and juicy as it is today. Carrots, things like that, we've done that with for a long time. Breeds of dogs are another example of selective breeding. Nowadays, though, we're actually doing genetic engineering. And so we've picked it up a notch. We're taking genes, we're splicing genes, we're removing genes, we're adding genes. We're doing some pretty crazy stuff from one species to another. And we're playing with that system. And so it'll be interesting to see how we handle that as years go forward. And so species diversity is a term that we've talked about a little bit here, but it's an important part of this class to understand species diversity. It is the number of different species combined with the abundance of those species. And so it's important for us to have lots of different kinds and enough of each kind to have a hardy ecosystem. And so species richness is all the different kinds, and we talked about that when we talked about parking lot biodiversity and when you were counting cars, basically. Different makes or different models or different styles of cars, different species, just how many of them are there. And then the idea of, well, how many of each kind is there present? We don't want dominance of one species and very few of another. We want an evenness to the amount of species within an ecosystem. And the combination of those two things lead to better biodiversity and stronger ecosystems as a result. Just so you know, when we look at that species diversity, we find it to be highest in the tropics, where there's more sun and water present, and it declines as we move away from the equator towards the poles. So species-rich places, rainforests, coral reefs, the ocean bottom, tropical lakes are examples of a lot of good, diverse species richness. And then as you work your way out from that, it shrinks down. So why do we want species richness? Well, it increases productivity within that ecosystem, and so productive ecosystems thrive. In addition, it creates a stability and sustainability to the environment. So if beetle kill comes through and takes out one type of tree, there's lots of other tree options in that ecosystem, so the ecosystem can still exist if that's the case. Greater richness means greater ability to withstand and rebound from problems like droughts and diseases and invasive species. And so we want that on our planet. Last section. So some of these terms I'm going to whip through fast because you guys have a pretty good idea what they are. Niche, or ecological niche, is the role that an organism plays in an ecosystem. And so you learned about that back in biology. You might not have heard of fundamental niche versus realized niche, okay? And so there's a slight difference in these two things. So if you look through these really quick, the full potential range of physical, chemical, and biological conditions and resources a species could theoretically, this is the term that matters here, use. So a fundamental niche is all the potential roles they could play in that particular ecosystem. The realized niche is if they were to survive and avoid competition, what part of that fundamental niche would they actually use? So this is illustrated right down here. The fundamentals, all the potential things they could be doing, and the realized one is what they actually do niche-wise. And so birds, for instance, all try to find a niche that doesn't overlap with each other, because overlapping niches make for competition, and competition means one species usually loses out and becomes more extinct. And so if you look at just a coastal shoreline from shallow to deep, you'll find that species, certain things, piping plovers, for instance, work this region. Flamingos work this area, and they've kind of separated this out into different areas. And so they can now avoid fighting with each other over things. No longer competition. They all have their own individual food sources where they can eat, what they can work with, and so no competition means they can all be happy. In addition, when it comes to species, certain types of species are better adapted to be successful long-term. Other ones are more specialized, and there's benefits and drawbacks to both. But a generalist is a species that can tolerate huge changes and huge variation. So their niche is really broad. So this blue line represents a generalist species. They can live and eat and do lots of different things in lots of different places. A specialist species is one that has a niche that's really narrow, and that's this red one. They like certain things in certain places at certain times. A panda is a prime example. They eat one kind of thing. They live in one certain place. So these guys are very susceptible to extinction. And a raccoon just isn't as much so, okay? And so then we come up with these last bits of terms and ideas here. And I'm going to have to cut us off here, and I will start talking about that in this next little video clip, all right?